They were city girls sent to work on farms all over Australia. It was remarkable then, and 80 years on, even more so.
2/3 of the enlisted women in the Women's Land Army were women who had never jumped a barbed wire fence, they'd never milked a cow, they'd never picked strawberries and boxed them or driven a tractor. They were young women who wanted to help out and wanted to keep Australia running as the breadbasket of the Allied force.
The government was grappling with a big problem facing the country's agriculture sector. Men were needed on the front line, but those same men were the farmers responsible for producing food, desperately needed to feed Australian troops, as well as visiting US troops and to send to the UK. So with the men away, women were called on.
Women on the land, taking the age-old place which in English-speaking countries at least has always been reserved for man.
More than 3,000 women volunteered in the Australian Land Army during the Second World War. Many were as young as 16.
The girls quickly established themselves as hard, keen workers, capable of performing most of the tasks male workers usually handle.
My mum's name was Beryl Johnson.
Can you show me some of the things from that time?
Lorraine Newton is the daughter of a Land Army member who signed on to serve in Queensland.
And this is Mum. That would have been about the age that she was 16 then when that photo was taken.
Wow, so young.
Yeah.
And this is right before she joined the
This would have been just before she joined. She saw this ad in the Women's Weekly. Her and her friend thought this would be a good opportunity.
Beryl died in 2019, but fortunately, we can still hear her memories of that time. 20-odd years earlier, her story was recorded as part of an Anzac Day program on a local radio station. Her daughter still has both the cassette tape and a working tape deck.
I'd turned 17 when I joined, and from there on, you know, I stayed on right through the wartime. No, I had nobody. I knew nobody that was going up there or even in the Land Army, but there turned out to be another 5 or 6 on the train.
Like all land girls, as they came to be known, Beryl quickly learnt to turn her hand to many different jobs.
I loved working outside on the farms and did all sorts of things, picked cotton, picked up potatoes. And yes, I think it's something we can all be proud of, the Australian Women's Land Army.
This fruit, fresh and luscious, will soon be delivered at forward areas, the gift of the Land Army girls to the frontline boys. And this is one of their easiest jobs.
They were trailblazers, but they were quiet trailblazers. They were doing these things that were unprecedented in that culture and that society at the time, but they were doing them without complaint. They were just picking up their shovels and their pickaxes and their trowels, and they were just going to work.
Well, we've travelled quite 1,000 miles or more to pick the cotton grown at Theodore.
For Beryl, the Land Army took her from the far north to cotton picking in central Queensland, and then on to the state's southern inland, before eventually she was stationed in the Redlands on Brisbane's Bayside.
She came down and she was billeted at the Outridge, the Redland Bay pub. There was a big old property there belonging to, I believe it was a Mr Henderson, and she worked for them.
Is your mum here?
That's Mum.
That's your mum.
It wasn't all work though, and the offer of a lift to a local dance would change the course of Beryl's life.
This fella turned up on the motorbike, and lo and behold, that ended up being my father.
Doug Price was a third-generation Redlands farmer who'd been medically discharged from the army. He and Beryl were married after the war ended, and they remained on the land where they raised their family.
Dad was a farmer. There's his Clydesdale's horse Strawberry.
Quite incredible, really, to think about, you know, what grew out of that meeting.
That's right.
Your mum came to this area as a Land Army girl, and the family that then grew from that's quite incredible.
It is, and it was a great life growing up on a farm. It really was.
Today, the Redlands area, half an hour east of Brisbane, bears little resemblance to a farming district.
This Birkdale School of Arts Hall was set up for the community. The Women's Land Army were apparently camped around the outside of this hall. At 5:30 they'd get woken up and then they had to be in here by 6:30 to have breakfast, and then they would go out into the fields. They were some of the most extraordinary pioneers because they were doing things and transforming our understanding, particularly for women, of what women could do.
And while the work could be hard and tedious, for many of the women it was also the beginning of lifelong connections.
Mum had those friendships all their lives. She kept in touch. My mother was a great letter writer. Mum would write 2 or 3 letters a week. You know, she just loved that communication and hearing how people were and what they were doing.
Not too far from the Birkdale School of Arts is the Redlands Museum, where there are more stories about the land girls and the part they played in shaping this district.
So Rick, why was the Redlands area special when it comes to the Land Army?
Well, it's pretty special because it was a big farming area. So important it was known as the Salad Bowl of Queensland.
The museum has a special connection to Beryl's family. It's built on the site where the Price farm once was. Some of her memorabilia from her service in the Land Army is now on display here.
She was well loved by lots of people here and donated her uniform to the museum.
So this was Beryl's
Minus
uniform?
the hat.
Right,
This was her
you're
uniform.
still looking for the hat.
We want a hat. If anyone out there has got a hat and would like to donate it to the museum, we'd be delighted, but we've been trying for a long time and haven't had any success.
Have you got the dungarees in the collection at all? No.
No.
They probably disintegrated
Probably
after all that hard work.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
These are some of the girls of the New Brigade who realise that it's not just a man's war.
From dairying to driving tractors, it was work unlike anything most women were used to doing in Australia in the 1940s. And it saw land girls sent to all corners of our country.
It changed the way women were perceived as peers, members of the workforce, and for so many young women looking at the Land Army girls, they were heroes.
Unfortunately, despite their hard work during those war years, the women weren't only looked at as heroes.
The city girls love the country scenery, they say. Dad and Dave agree that the views improve.
Sexism aside, perhaps what's more shocking is how long these women had to fight for official recognition of their service after the war was over.
They did, of course, allow the Land Army girls to join certain members of retired forces, but they weren't part of the RSL. It was a different kind of retired services that they were allowed to join. And they didn't receive the same kinds of benefits post-war that the other women's branches received either.
It wasn't until 1985, some 40 years after the war had ended, that the land girls were even allowed to march on Anzac Day.
They fought for a long, long time to be recognised. And the day that they were allowed to march was a great day, and Mum was so thrilled, and there was just so many Land Army girls that day marching proudly in their green jackets on Anzac Day.
In 1995, half a century after their service, former Land Army members were finally awarded with a Civilian Service Medal. And then in 2012, they were officially thanked by the federal government. For many, sadly, it was too late.
For a long time, those women just quietly served and then went home again. Recognition of their service has been incredibly important for them, and I think also for Australia, because if we don't recognise that service and we aren't aware that that service even occurred, then how can we have a full understanding of the history of gender equality and gender dynamics within Australia?
Today, they are remembered in monuments and museums. But importantly, their service and its significance in helping both the war effort and in keeping Australian farms afloat is something to be celebrated.
I think it's wonderful that it's out there to be seen, that other people can go and see and read their stories.
Despite the wiseacres and carping critics, women have been a success on the land. They are doing a vital war job in the country, and doing it well.
That is really quite something to me. I think that's it's really admirable to know that these women were quietly changing the world behind the scenes. And it's a shame that it's taken so long to remember that part of our history.
Country and city folks alike must back up to the limit these grand girls, striving to do a big job for Australia.